Good evening and welcome to the latest edition of Al-Shabaka's Policy Labs. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I'm the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, and I'm honored to be with you tonight, facilitating this important discussion about the implications of US President Biden's recent visit to the region for Palestinians and Palestine activism within colonized Palestine and across the Arab world. US President Joe Biden's July 2022 visit to Israel and Saudi Arabia signified a new era of regional alliances that are inextricably linked to the expanding normalization deals heralded by the Abraham Accords. Indeed, the shadow of former US President Trump's administration looms large over the region, with the US appearing more determined to buttress authoritarian and apartheid regimes across the region with military and technological superiority, particularly for future confrontations with Iran. For many on the ground, this developing so-called security alliance with Israel at the helm is deeply concerning and could potentially thwart, if not fully oppress, Palestine advocacy, both in normalizing states and across Palestine. What must Palestinians learn from these troubling regional developments? What can they and their allies in the Arab world do to ensure the viability of the Palestinian liberation movement? Joining us tonight to discuss these dynamics and address these questions and more are Dan Kurd and Amjad Iraqi. Al-Shabaka policy analyst Dan Kurd is assistant professor of political science at the University of Richmond and a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington. She holds a PhD in government with concentrations in comparative politics and international relations. She is author of Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Al-Shabaka policy analyst Amjad Iraqi is an editor and writer at 972 magazine based in Haifa. He was previously an advocacy coordinator at Adala, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. In addition to 972, his writings have appeared in the London Review of Books, The Guardian, The Nation, and Le Monde Diplomatique, among others. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to inform our viewers tonight of the format of the lab. For the first 30 minutes or so, I will pose questions to Dan and Amjad. During the second half, our speakers will answer questions from you. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question below. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. If possible, please direct your question to one of our speakers. And as always, I'll do my best to address as many of the questions as I can. So let's begin. Amjad, I'd like us to start with you. As you are based in Palestine, can you share your insights into the implications of Biden's visit to the region for Palestinians across colonized Palestine within 1948 territories and in the occupied West Bank and Gaza? What does the visit signify for them and for the movement locally?
Thank you, Nadim, and I'm thrilled to be on with Dana, and thank you to Al-Shabaka for all the amazing work, including these policy labs. Very grateful for the time offered here. So in terms of this first question about the implications, I think in many ways, the Biden visit in July didn't really teach us anything new. Many of the things that were blessed by Biden's visit through when he came to Israel and then when he went to Saudi Arabia are quite well known. I mean, Biden has always been very infatuated with the relationship with Israel, and there have been hints for a very long time that the United States was kind of having a bit of a return or rapprochement again with the Crown Prince, and that there was a normalization deal possibly brewing. So we kind of knew all this was happening. With that said, I think as almost forgettable as that visit was in a way, it should be very much a wake-up call for Palestinians to really realize the depths to which this moment really symbolizes a drastic shift in our contextual reality. And the key question that was very much occupying my mind as I was watching all this unfold was, are Palestinians succeeding in accumulating and shifting the power dynamics, and accumulating power and shifting the power dynamics to advance our liberation struggle? And the Biden visit really gave a lot of very kind of dark and sobering answers. It's not all doom and gloom, but it really requires us to ask some very significant questions. To kind of put it very simply, so for a long time, when it comes to Palestinian approach to power dynamics, we've always kind of gone through sort of a two-pronged strategy. So one has been about decreasing Israeli power, that is, decreasing its power to occupy, its ability to launch wars, its ability to maintain the apartheid regime, about really reducing and shrinking the power of our oppressor. And the second prong is about building Palestinian power, ensuring our own agency, ensuring our own self-determination and fate is in our own hands, to provide ourselves with resources and mobilization. And naturally, these two prongs are very interrelated. It's you can't have one without the other, and you certainly can't have Palestinian agency without removing the boots of the Israeli regime. With that said, again, this is kind of simplifying a little bit, but I think since the 1990s, the Palestinian struggle has been very much focused on that first prong, on trying to decrease Israeli state power, quite naturally. We've been shifting a lot towards the approach of international law and talking about Israel's obligations as an occupying power and to human rights treaties and trying to get states to enforce international law. On a different level, you've had the political leadership, rightly and wrongly, that tied itself to a peace process led by the United States, turning to Washington primarily as a potential, as an agent to kind of tame Israeli power. That was the mindset, one of the aspects of the mindsets of the PLO when it initiated negotiations and the Oslo Accords and everything since. You have this another front with like the BDS movement, which of course is about trying to mobilize international consumers, companies, governments, what have you, to create a price on the Israeli state's policies. And of course, even just like the general sort of international awareness raising, making people aware about their complicity and what Israel is doing and how can they, remove their complicity or remove their enabling of Israeli activities in order to create the space for Palestinians to build their power, in order to minimize harm, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these are very crucial, vital, important. But because of this overemphasis on it, and what I worry is sometimes a bit of a reduction, or we're not considering enough about that second prong, has kind of, it needs to be put back onto the table for us to understand that we've been missing that second prong very much. And the Biden visit really helped to sharpen that understanding. It showed that, in fact, the strategy of trying to decrease Israeli power, which we obviously should be continuing, isn't really succeeding at the pace that we wanted to. It's made a lot of advancements, made a lot of progress, and really shifted a lot of elements of power, but the Biden visit really showed that it's not operating fast enough for a whole host of complex reasons. But just an example, point number one is that over the past decade, the Israeli state has become even more powerful. Its economy is booming. Its trade with its international alliances are deepening. Its arms trade and technology and all these are now becoming, the go-tos for a lot of states and governments and autocrats all around the world. And when combined with all that is the fact that its hold on the occupied territories is so entrenched, is so much more sustainable than it ever was, and it's really enjoying such unprecedented impunity that you couldn't really, which it always had in many respects, but the power trip that's operating in Israeli society and in the Israeli state institutions is nothing compared to what it was a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago. That's a very important shift. On point number two, the fact that the quote unquote Abraham Accords and the Arab normalization agreements has shown that the Arab states and the Arab autocrats specifically, they don't care anymore about Palestine as a core issue. I think it's important to always recognize that the Arab states have always had a very problematic, often undermining role in the Palestinian struggle, and public opinion, which I think Dan will explain with great expertise, of like the clash between the Arab leaderships and the Arab publics in that respect. But the fact that these normalizations are not happening shows that the Arab states are even abandoning, for example, the Arab League's peace initiative of 2002, which was under a two-state solution. But like that was something that the Arab world supposedly said that normalization is contingent upon a Palestinian state, and over just in the space of a couple of years, it's been completely abandoned. Again, you can debate the peace initiative, but the very fact of that as being something that held back Israeli power, that held back regional normalization has now dissolved. And that in the end, these Arab states are more interested in their alliances with Israel and with the US, etc. This is a major power shift. And just point number 3, and I'll kind of close off here for now, is also within the United States. On the one hand, we've of course had many major strides in the United States in terms of pushing Palestine and Palestine advocacy in areas that did not exist a decade, 2 decades ago. I think public awareness and public discourse has really grown tremendously in making Americans more aware of Israel-Palestine. And you're seeing these shifts from a Palestinian American community that's more empowered, with the American Jewish community that's cracking its support of Israel and Zionism, with like Black communities and indigenous communities coming out for Palestine, with members of Congress now starting to push for bills about conditioning military aid. So you're seeing these in many different fronts, but at the same time, you have, for example, state and federal legislation that's now effectively criminalizing BDS. You're now having a complete conflation of, that Palestine equals anti-Semitism, and to be Palestinian is to be anti-Semitic. The very fact that Biden, with all of the pressures in the Democratic Party, still went to Israel and then to Saudi Arabia to bless this normalization agreement shows that the White House is still in a very, very different place from where it is in Congress. And even in Congress, the ones who are supportive of Palestine are still a very small minority with not sufficient power. So the visit really just kind of brought a lot of these things to full clarity, to say that, yes, we should be pursuing this approach. Yes, we need to keep decreasing Israeli power, but for a whole host of reasons, we are not there yet. We're not helping to shift it fast enough, because now apartheid is very much entrenched. The region is now shifted very much towards Israel, and the United States at this point is still as far away as ever in even helping to remove its complicity in the Israeli state. And our own resistance on the ground here to the Israeli state has also, for all complex reasons, has not been able to unshackle us from the occupation and from discriminatory laws, etc. There's a lot to unpack, I know, and there's more to talk about for the second prong, but I'll kind of close off here and I'll hand it over back to you, Nadim.
Thank you, Amjad. I think you really sort of laid out to us the sobering aspect of this reality. I want to delve deeper into the regional dynamics before we move on to sort of implications of the visit and what needs to be done. Dana, you recently published a piece in the Washington Post about the implications of Biden's visit, not only for Palestinians, but for the region, including for Palestine advocates and anti-normalization groups in normalizing states. Can you tell us more about what these changing dynamics signify at the regional at the regional level, and for Palestine allies in the Arab world?
All right, here we go. The mute finally worked. Thank you for having me. And so, yeah, I talked in that piece specifically about, similar to what Amjad was talking about, how the Americans are really pushing this normalization between Israel and Arab states. And some of it is going to be, garish Abraham Accords levels, and some of it is not going to be at that level, but it's still going to create different dynamics for both Palestinians and their allies in the region. Arab governments, some of them are finding such a turn to Israel useful to balance Iran and for other reasons. And I argued in the piece that this is having really negative repercussions, as you said, both at the regional level and for Palestinians in historic Palestine. So starting with Palestine kind of advocates in the region, pro-Palestine groups, anti-normalization groups. So I talk in that piece and in my research about how these advocates are facing more repression as a result of these normalization deals. This is because a couple of reasons. Because pro-Palestine organizations are often these groups that are like generators of dissent in these countries, as they're often some of the only independent civil society actors in these very highly repressive contexts. And obviously they're against the normalization deals. So when Arab governments normalize, this often means that they preemptively crack down on any source of potential backlash towards the normalization policy. And we've seen this happen in the countries that have officially normalized. So both Bahrain and the UAE, in the lead up to and the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, they've criminalized pro-Palestine activity, they've stopped protests, they've shut down organizations. There's been a lot of examples of this, travel bans and all sorts of stuff. And it's important to note that governments know this, and we know this, that polling consistently shows the Palestinian issue is really important to Arab populations. In the latest polling from 2021, I think 89% of Arab citizens polled across 12 different countries oppose normalization with Israel. And there's been some more recent polling just in the normalizing states by people who, by organizations that are pro-normalization that still find kind of a minority support for the position of normalization. So this creates this divergence, this bifurcation between Arab governments and their societies, and those tensions make repression more likely. And governments understand that, so they're not shy about using that kind of repression in this age of impunity. And secondly, normalization agreements are also facilitating increased coordination between the Israeli government and the normalizing states. So that means sharing surveillance technologies, for example, coordinating about these kind of crackdowns. So pro-Palestine advocacy in the region is immediately impacted by these agreements as activists come under greater government surveillance. I'm not saying that all of it started with the Abraham Accords. We've had normalization before the Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel, for example, but it is at a much higher and more escalated pace. So all of that has implications for basically the space for freedom of expression and association and critique in the region. Now, for Palestinians, in historic Palestine, this push for Arab normalization means that kind of one of the last remaining forms of regional leverage is gone. So as we all know, the official policy with the Arab Peace Initiative used to be that Israel would only get official recognition if there was like movement on the two-state solution. And as problematic as that was, this was a little bit of a form of leverage. But now, as Amjad mentioned, the official policy of a number of Arab governments has moved beyond this line, not even just the unofficial behind the scenes. So Palestinians are more and more isolated. And of course, I agree with everything Amjad said. The Palestinians on the ground, have agency, and they're always going to have the most impact on like the conditions of occupation, regardless of the positions of regional governments. And what I'm saying about all of this is not necessarily to overstate the efficacy of Arab governments in the past, or to suggest that even their kind of weak anti-normalization stance was doing much for Palestinians. We can be honest about that, but I would say that this latest blatant kind of normalization and American support for that moving forward is qualitatively a shift. It is an escalation because it has, as I said, led to more coordination, which means investments and development of the coercive apparatuses of these countries, including Israel's. So these agreements have already led and will continue to lead to a strengthening of Israeli technology, a strengthening of its capacity for repression. And as we all know, these surveillance tools and weapons that Israeli companies go on to sell elsewhere are first tested and used on Palestinians. So there's that aspect. And then another issue is that given Arab governments are going in that direction, this has elevated actors like Iran. So we see, for example, Hamas has reconciled with Iran. And there's also, I think, a growing sentiment among activists that a turn to Iran is the best option. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that given Iran is a very reactionary force in the region, this turn will also have negative repercussions. Again, it's a turn externally rather than how to, address our conditions on the ground, and it'll especially be problematic as we alienate potential allies in the region. So overall, I think this kind of latest push both increasingly incapacitates our allies in the region, as well as has led to kind of harmful turns with regards to Palestinian resistance that'll make it harder for Palestinian activists to make inroads with the necessary allies in the region. Yeah.
Thank you, Dana, for the regional perspective. I want to take us back to Palestine and moving the conversation ahead to thinking more in terms of policy and action and what can and should be done. Amjad, going back to the sort of sobering reality you were describing, how do you believe Palestinians can and should build a new power base across Palestine? What does Palestinian power building within both 1948 territories and across occupied territories look like in the context of expanding normalization and state-led oppression?
Yeah, this is the kind of million-dollar question. And thank you, Dan, also for your remarks, also clarifying a lot of like major pieces in all this. I mean, actually, Dan herself, when she wrote her book about kind of Palestine, like demobilization and all and essentially kind of her book kind of excellently kind of portrayed exactly how much a lot of fissures in Palestinian society and Palestinian politics have really demobilized us quite extensively. And in the end, and especially when it comes to our political echelons, there's still very much a kind of brick wall that's created by the PLO, created by Fatah, created by Hamas, and by this factionalism and these kind of elites who are, taking hold of the struggle and determining it for all the terrible wrong reasons, while being authoritarian. And Dennis' book is really great at kind of talking about also the the patrimonial structures that exist within society that have not consumed and subsumed so much of it. While recognizing that, where we do see kind of avenues of Palestinian agency, we're quite a lot of them are quite stark. For example, during what we describe as Unity Intifada in May 2021, which it has a more complex legacy than just about the concept of unity, but it showed the tremendous ability on the grassroots level and through a lot of different aspects of leverage that we've accumulated over the years to really shift the tide in terms of how the world understood Palestine, in terms of Palestinians connecting with each other and maximizing those connections across the Green Line, from Gaza to the West Bank to inside Israel to the diaspora. There's some that can't be taken for granted. The technologies that our generation have today that our previous generations didn't have, that has been a core facilitator of this regeneration of Palestinian identity, to the point that 18-year-olds today are maybe even more passionate about their Palestinian identity and more assertive of it than my generation, ours, my parents or our grandparents. And it's not just a superficial thing. Like the very fact that we saw this major flash of unity and all these demonstrations and this assertion that we are one people is important. It really helped for us to clarify this joint analysis of what our oppression is. And we showed that when you really do kind of mobilize across the Green Line, you shake the system. Now, the Unity Intifada was great at that, but of course we didn't end occupation, we didn't end apartheid or colonialism, but it helped to shake the system to realize that they can keep going about these tactics, but something's still not working. The Palestinian people are still there as an identity, demanding the agency for themselves. And what a big lesson of the Unity Intifada is now is, how do you sustain that? Like, it's not enough just to have it as a flash. And obviously this is still connected with Israeli repression and subjugation and ongoing colonialism in all its forms. But we really need to ask ourselves, what are the things that we can control that to re-empower our own communities, and also how can we especially come the problem of internal fragmentation. Now, there are naturally, like any society, like any movement, we're a movement has certain divisions in class, in terms of geography, in terms of political ideology, and our factionalism, what have you. But a big concern that I'm worried that maybe some of us have been identifying is somehow our movement building became a little bit too siloed. And this kind of comes back to Dennis' book a lot about this polarization starting to exist, which goes beyond Palestine in many ways. But the fact that polarization is happening requires us to think about, how do we ensure a broad tent for Palestinians to genuinely feel part of the movement? That it's not just enough to say that you are Palestinian. No, you're a Palestinian with a certain kind of idea or thinking, and we want to create space to talk about that, to be able to think strategically, how do we do this in a way that I don't think hasn't been done very collectively in many years. And a lot of the hope is that the PLO would be an engine for this, but we have alternatives. We have a very vibrant civil society that is trying to create these spaces for Palestinians to converse and to strategize and to take action in different ways. And even the communication technologies we're using on social media are very important in terms of facilitating that dialogue and that conversation, and facilitating those networks. And core point in this is to ensure that we're not sort of cannibalizing on each other, and the kind of puritanism that starts to seep into aspects of the movement, which always good to kind of push ourselves in the radical ends. But I worry a lot that this puritanism is again making the movement consume itself. This operates not just on social media, which is kind of very a big incubator for that, but also on the ground. And how are we also not communicating with each other to say that it's okay for another Palestinian to have a certain kind of view. And we don't need to have a certain litmus test, because in the end, those litmus tests aren't true. And so the more we understand we need to take that step for Palestinians, we can also do the same for our allies abroad. And this is where the concept of intersectionality is very important. We need to understand that Palestine is as vital as it is and as interconnected as it is not the center of the universe. We are one of many issues that are going on in the world, from Yemen to China to Ethiopia. And we need to understand that intersectionality provides us a window to explain to people, to allow people to understand, how can you use your agency to help us in the same way that you're doing so for your communities in the United States or in Europe or in your Arab country, what have you. That intersectionality is the key to entangling us with other struggles. Because in the end, our sources of oppression, the state and the far right or what have you, they are employing intersectionality themselves. They're connecting, they're uniting on a global level. And so we need to start understanding that we need to do the same, and not to do it based on, this is what a real Palestinian is, but to say that let's provide forms and spaces to do this. Let's educate ourselves to be more mindful of that concept of broad tent movement building. And I realize that this is kind of really a bit broad and conceptual, but I can't emphasize as much how just that very philosophical basis is enough to provide the space for Palestinians to genuinely coalesce around each other and to really think about how we can begin to utilize much of the power, agency, socioeconomic power, communications, that we can begin to really gather around a certain idea of what we want that's not contingent upon the political leadership.
Thank you, Amjad, and I'm sorry about that. I was also having trouble unmuting. Before moving on to the Q&A, I'd like to take a similar question and pose it to Dana on the regional perspective. What can Palestinians and their allies do to counter these expanding normalization deals that threaten the viability of the movement?
And unmuted myself. Lie. I just want to say, Amjad's answer was, exactly on point. I hope you guys have a transcript of this later. We can print it out, frame it for everybody, because this is so crucial. I have seen that kind of fragmentation. I think that this is a serious problem, and while our enemies unite, we are more and more dividing. But to answer, back to your question, Nadim. So I'll start by saying that I agree with a lot of what Amjad has said about our external focus. And I think that when we Palestinians have focused on external actors, we have for far too long focused our attention on Western audiences and governments and civil society. And now we're increasingly understanding the limits of that. So the fact that a lot of our energy has been directed towards Western civil society organizations, getting them to admit to apartheid conditions or convincing one congressman or another, I think it hasn't been the best use of our resources. And in the end, it really has moved the needle only a little bit. So despite a lot of the successes in the aftermath of the Unity Intifada, especially despite the successes BDS has had or any kind of broader pro-Palestine advocacy has had in the US or Europe, especially on the level of discourse, what really tangibly has been the difference for us? Not clear. Biden's visit to the region is a case in point in this. And so at this point, I'm reiterating what Amjad was saying. And I would argue furthermore that wasting our energies in that direction means we have ignored the allies we have in the region and the potential to build power with them. So Amjad was talking about intersectionality and how Palestine is not the center of the universe. And he mentioned different places, but we have a regional context as well, where Palestine is not the center of the universe, but is part and parcel of a lot of these issues that plague the region. And I understand, of course, that there are some Palestinian organizations working in the region. There are, for example, BDS chapters, but it's been a much smaller effort than what we have tried to do in convincing Western audiences. And generally, I think it's almost as if we kind of just discount the ability of people in the region to change conditions for themselves or for us. And then when we do engage, we've made a lot of mistakes as well. So there have been cases of BDS groups not working with local activists as equal partners, or having kind of these campist, unnuanced positions on Iran's role in alienating people. So we've done all of that instead of identifying potential allies and figuring out alongside them how best to kind of disrupt these nodes of oppression that have developed between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi and Rabat and wherever else. And that's what we need to do to counter normalization to move forward. We need to work with pro-Palestine advocates in the region and take their potential seriously, not as Palestinians giving orders, as equal partners in this struggle. And to accomplish that, it means that we can't ally with actors that are sources of oppression in the region, like Iran or crazy Russian-funded Western leftists or something like that. It's not only morally bankrupt, but it would absolutely lose the goodwill of Arab publics, and it'll help those who want this broader official normalization to take root at a societal and cultural level. Those who want to convince Arab populations that the Palestinian cause is not one of importance to them and is in fact a source of insecurity for them. So in general, I think we really have to start realizing that Palestine is not in a bubble. And that our struggle is part of a regional context of kind of neocolonialism, and that our struggle is not one that's going to be resolved in DC or Boston or New York, with all due respect to the advocacy that happens there. We need to try to build that power by finding our allies in the region and working alongside them to change the conditions for all of us, because the root causes of our material reality are shared. Yani, to address the source of growing Israeli power, we need to confront anti-authoritarian Arab governments and vice versa. So at least for me, that was one silver lining of the Abraham Accords, or I hope is a silver lining, is that it revealed this reality very clearly.
Thank you both for this very informative discussion. I have a question for Amjad. I want to take us back to the Palestine context. Given that it was sort of the Israeli context specifically, and given that the political deadlock that the Israeli Knesset has been in for over 3 years now, this will be the 5th round of elections coming up in November, and given that Palestinian representation in the Knesset forms a significant part of the crisis, sort of informs a significant part of the deadlock. What does this? Well, maybe you can tell us a bit more about this context within Israeli politics, but also what it implies and what it signifies for the movement building that you were describing earlier.
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, but it's hard to really explain how much Israeli politics, the political sphere and wider Israeli Jewish society is so seeped in its impunity, and it's so seeped in this kind of this almost this psychological separation of themselves from the Palestinians, which is there's a weird dissonance there, because on the one hand, we, for all intents and purposes, are living under one single regime, from Gaza to inside 48 to the West Bank. It operates under one state, one rule, with different all these different complex systems, but they operate in that same thing. But most of Jewish Israeli society could basically live without any care or consideration for Palestinians. And that's always been the case in some form or another. But again, the depth to which that has been very much entrenched is very evident, and it's evident in the political sphere. Like the battles that are now going on between the Israeli political parties, oftentimes is not really ideological. It's very personal. There's still a huge Netanyahu focus. It's more like you have a lot of parties which basically echo each other in this sort of quote unquote center right to far right kind of policies, but they just have personal differences. Or they make this little tweak. So what you're getting inside the Israeli political sphere is just these battles within the Israeli right, which has dominated the Israeli political scene, where there's a core consensus, which is kind of, it's not clear, but it's there's a core consensus that you maintain the occupation, you maintain the regime, and you debate over how much further you want to take it. So the fact that the lead contenders, or people vote for parties, not for prime minister, but the fact that the Likud party, led by Netanyahu, that there's a there's a centrist party led by Yair Lapid, and there's a center-right party now led by Gantz and Saab. These are all, for all intents and purposes, right-wing figures. And so there needs to be, and it just shows that, again, there's no one to really reach out to on this, there's no one to reach out to in a way that might have existed even 3 decades ago. And even this is not to kind of put the center left in the positive light in any way. They were the ones who initiated the occupation. They're the ones who maintained it, entrenched it, and are still defending and justifying it in many ways. But again, that hardening is very crucial. As to where Palestinians in 48 kind of fit into this, I mean, unfortunately, we're part of that internal fragmentation. I think Al-Shabaka has some discussions about this, whereby the joint list, which was kind of a united slate of all these different Arab factions, for all the pros and cons and of this list, it was this attempt at this united front. And there are many questionable decisions, but in the end, personal infighting and these kind of and there's a debate about how far will you go to get influence in the Knesset. It just allowed for that fragmentation to destroy what was otherwise a potential engine for Palestinian politics inside Israel. So now the fact that you have like the shrunken joint list and like the Islamist Ra'am, which has been the one allying with the government, it's unfortunately showing that that we're still being used as toys in these Israeli political scenes to kind of establish a coalition, and we're not being dealt with on our terms. And this is really on the Arab political parties, because they started pegging their platforms so much on the Knesset, on legislation, and not thinking enough about how do you engage with the public in a meaningful way. What does it mean as political leaders to really ensure our connections with Palestinians across the Green Line? And they do, but it's always under this umbrella of we are still Israeli citizens, we are still demanding only equality, we still operate under the two-state solution framework, which is the official line of the political parties. And this needs to be challenged and questioned. And this is why I think even in this election, the big story is almost not so much what's going to happen with the Israeli right camp. For all intents and purposes, we might end up having a sixth election. But the real interesting question is what the Palestinian community inside Israel is now reflecting on about Ra'am's experience. It's now reflecting on, after the unity and Intifada, is now reflecting on in terms of what matters to us more, and to try to re-gravitate that to understanding that our fate does not lie in the Israeli parliament. Our fate does not lie under an Israeli rubric of existence. But this is an ongoing discussion and conversation, but it's inherently tied to how Palestinian politics and society is operating in the occupied territories and the diaspora. It can't be disentangled. And the more that there's that fissure within Palestinian politics at large, the more Palestinians in Israel are going to be looking to the Israeli system. So they're very tied.
Thank you, Amjad. Dana, I have a question for you. One of our audience members has a sort of a direct question that might have a more, a simpler answer, but I want to join it with something else that came up during our own discussion over the last couple of weeks. What is the significance of Palestine to the region? Why is it still, a significant cause? We've been discussing earlier that in many cases, Palestine has lost the Arabs, and we've even published pieces about that even before normalization, as you mentioned. So why is Palestine advocacy important regionally? Is it important to Palestinians as well? Is there a sort of reciprocal appreciation and maybe even respect, dependence, and so on? And linking this to the question that was posed by one of our audience members, what are some of these organizations in the region that Palestinians can work with to respond to authoritarianism in the region?
Okay, every time. Yeah. So to answer your question about what is the significance of Palestine to the region and like kind of the role it plays in civil society. So we know from repeated polling, as I said, that Palestine is an issue of importance to Arabs. So, for example, when asked about like what are the countries that are threaten your security, threaten your country's security the most, Israel and the United States are always the top. It depends on the country. Like some countries, U.S. is first, Israel second, but there's always the case. So people have an understanding that Israel's role in the region is to create insecurity for them as well. When we ask them about normalization, they largely oppose normalization. Now, in countries that are like more conflict ridden at the moment, or places like Iraq and Lebanon, it's like slightly reduced rates, so in the 60s rather than the 80s opposed to normalization. But that's still a majority. Like that's still, you know, a majority of people. There's not a single country where there's not a majority of people who oppose normalization. Why Palestine is important is because, well, there's, you know, a lot of reasons due to, you know, cultural kind of connections and things like that. The idea that Palestine is kind of one of these anti-colonial struggles that still exist in the region. All of that plays into the emotional sentiment. But also kind of politically and like at a strategic level, Palestine is really unifying. So like in Bahrain, there's a lot of sectarianism, frankly, and like a lot of polarization. And obviously, since the Arab Spring, like the political conditions in Bahrain have been eroded, you know, actively. But they can still all coalesce around Palestine, right? Like they can still all agree on their opposition to Israeli occupation and all of that. So that is a potentially kind of threatening position for pro-Palestine advocacy to play, because it's really one of the only few issues in a lot of different countries that can unite different political views and people from different political backgrounds. And that's a very powerful kind of I called it a threat multiplier in one of my in one of my interviews. Like it's a very threatening role to play. And then for how it has an impact on civil society, pro-Palestine advocacy, as I said, is one of these, you know, few spaces that are truly independent in a lot of these countries. So people who join or are active in or engage with in any way kind of pro-Palestine advocacy organizations, they might at the beginning just kind of have like like I said, like an emotional attachment to Palestine, or like be concerned about humanitarian issues or something like that. But it actually politicizes them. It politicizes them to start thinking about, well, actually, I'd have political agency. I want my government to do something. I am a citizen. I'm not a subject of my country. Why does my government have such a different policy than what people around me think? And that we see happening. And so I have a paper on like this happening in Qatar, for example, but I think that this really does travel elsewhere. And so that politicization factor and how it impacts also means that it's having broader repercussions on these civil societies. So pro-Palestine advocacy might be kind of like a niche topic, but it's also having an impact on these members who go on to engage in other political topics. And so like, you know, blossoms from there. And that's why it's been such a, you know, target of a lot of these governments, because they recognize that potential. Now, in terms of like the direct question, like who do Palestinians engage with? There are some, like in every country, there are people to engage with. There are people who are pro-Palestinian, who are pro-democracy, all of those things. In some cases, official organizations have been decimated, have been, you know, are now defunct or are no longer function, but their members exist if they have not already got to prison. But like, you know, some of them are in exile or you know, exist. But there are countries where there are actual like what we call kind of informal civil society organizations. So like in Qatar, there's the Qatar Youth Opposed to Normalization. There's the Gulf Coalition Against Normalization. That's like a Gulf broader umbrella. There's the Bahraini Youth, Bahraini Democratic Youth Society. I'm just translating quickly in my head, but like there's lots of different organizations that hold those kind of principled positions that are pro-Palestinian as well as anti-authoritarian and could be potential allies. And they're not necessarily hidden, you know, like I just think do a poor job, or like we make assumptions about what exists out there, and we do a poor job of connecting with people. Yeah, did I answer all the questions? Okay, yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you, Dana. I think something important that you bring up is sort of the idiom. We really do need to be engaging our allies in Arabic as well. And there's something about the BDS movement, the Western one, let's say, that really sort of anglicized that campaign. Amjad, I want to go back to, well, thank you to Muhammad, who's behind the scenes, for sharing your piece from The Nation in the group chat. I hope everyone gets a chance to read that. As well as Dana's piece in the Washington Post. I want to quote you from that piece. And as graduate students often do, I will read the very last line of the piece and go on to ask you to elaborate. So Zionism has done much to tear down the green line for its supremacist vision. Palestinians must now coalesce to replace that vision with a nobler one. I think we've discussed Palestinian movement building within and across colonized Palestine. I'd like to go back to the idea of intersectionality and to really think about what coalescing into a nobler movement that is not just confined to historic, geographic, colonized Palestine. What does that look like, given not only sort of authoritarianism, oppression from different states and so on, but also the limits of what Palestinians, I mean, as Dana just did, we need to also look inwardly and say, well, we have a problem building intersectional movements. There are limits to how much, well, there's also a lot of fragmentation within the movement, ideologically and religiously and so on. What are some of the, well, maybe the limitations of what intersectional movement building would look like? And then maybe if you have any insight into how intersectionality can look like for moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. It was very kind of you to also share the article. It's where to begin? I mean, that last line for me kind of encapsulates both a reality and a challenge. I mean, when we think about something I was mentioning in the piece, the piece itself is talking about just like how Palestinians have been connecting across the Green Line for decades and how we've been erasing it ourselves long before, even with kind of thanks to the Israeli state for consuming the land, but also through our connections in the social fabric we've been able to restore, which was never guaranteed after the Nakba. For all intents and purposes, we might have been completely dismembered. So there's an odd irony of 1967 being a cataclysm and also a vital lifeline for us to connect in a way that we otherwise couldn't have. And in terms of how this has kind of affected our thinking about liberation, or thinking about decolonization, and our relationship to the outside world, I mean, for a long time, the Palestinian struggle was deeply connected to the anti-colonial movements. This is something that Dan was mentioning. Like, at kind of like the heights of the Palestinian movement being really put on the global stage, we can say like, I don't know if like let's say 1970s. There was still this decolonial process that was operating around the world, and you had this also entailed different kinds of allies, entailed different forms of intersectionality, and Palestine was very much part and parcel of this wider, quote unquote, like third world movement. And now we're moving to an age where obviously we're still living with forms of colonialism and post-colonialism, but Palestine is still one of the very few like raw colonial projects that are still operating, and it bucked the trend of a lot of those other movements around the world. I mean, it's more complex than that, but it's now what this means for us is that, again, coming back to this, you need to reconsider the context in which we're operating our struggle. Anti-colonial struggle today is not the same thing as what it means a few decades ago. Decolonization also, we need to have much more interrogation about what that actually means, because we're kind of seeing the word coming up a lot more in the public discourse, and it's vital, and there's a whole body of thought and work and experience that goes into that, but we also shouldn't be simplifying it. The anti-colonial struggles that exist from Africa to the Middle East to East Asia, they weren't straightforward. They were very complicated, they were very ugly, very messy, often violent, and then what you got after the lifting of the colonial ruler was an authoritarian ruler, was a different kind of conflict and war, was some other kind of replacement in which the state often consumed the people in a liberation struggle. And that is actually the lesson from a lot of countries. So decolonization works to a point, depending on how you define it, but then what comes after? And this is both, a little harrowing on the one hand, but it's also should be sobering for us. Like it gives us an opportunity to ask, what did the other anti-colonial movements fail at? What did they miss? And the very fact that, for example, we have these Palestinian parties that consider themselves revolutionary parties, but they're basically echoing a lot of the same ways that other kind of revolutionary movements ended up hijacking the struggle, ended up hijacking the fate of the societies that they were representing. So in that level, there's intersectionality of knowledge and a bit of humility on our part to understand that colonialism and decolonization is more complex, and we really need to interrogate it. And it's not enough just to kind of toss out the word. So intersectionality helps in that, and helping us to learn how do we not make the mistakes of fellow people, fellow societies around the world. And where the limitations are, I mean, I think Nadim, you were mentioning this as well about like how even BDS, for example, has become like an anglicization of the movement. And again, and Dan was also mentioning about this Western focus, and it's very understandable because Israel attains a lot of its power and alliances from the Western world, and there's no doubt we need to keep pushing on that front. But then, for example, you get these kind of also divisions within the Palestinian community of like, how do you articulate your struggle? So, for example, Palestinian Americans and even Palestinians inside Israel will often use the term equality, and it means different things for different people. But you know, you go to a Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza, maybe also like in the refugee camps, and like, no, equality is not the thing on our minds. It's not that we don't consider ourselves as equal human beings, but that it connotates a very different political vision. It connotates something vis-a-vis the Jewish Israeli as a settler, as an oppressor, as a society which also Palestinians are not fully wanting to be a part of. So what does that mean on our front as well? Like, and so that also that intersectionality that's played in the United States, for example, does not always apply here on the ground. And the same thing that that our anti-colonial discourse here doesn't no longer clicks with a lot of places around the world. So yeah, I mean, this is just kind of like a discursive limitation of intersectionality, but it's again requires us to interrogate what we think we know and who we can turn to. And again, and to turn inwards in the sense that we need to be more open and honest about how we also coalesce our own intersectionalities within our societies. Again, on class, geography, ideology, etc. And it just keeps coming back to that very core point.
Thank you, Amjad. Dana, coming back to you, I want to both pose a question that was asked earlier in the Q&A and also link it to some sort of other global developments, rather. So recently in the news, I was seeing that a senior Russian official had met with the commander of the Palestinian Authority security forces to discuss military and intelligence cooperation. This as Russia or Moscow and Tel Aviv are increasingly butting heads following the war in the Ukraine. What role is there in this growing security alliance in the region in the age of normalization? What role is there for non-allied governments such as Russia, such as China, and other players?
We have to kind of put scope conditions on some of our expectations from these things. So like whether it's Russia or China, I truly do not believe that there is a positive role for these kinds of authoritarian governments that are engaged in imperial aggression elsewhere to play for Palestinians. I mean, China, for example, has had growing ties with Israel. There's a lot of sharing of technology and development of shared capacity for repression. China sees Israel as like a hub of that kind of security. All the different things that fall under security industry, and Russia as well. Like, okay, there is some Israel is kind of playing a balancing act between the United States and Russia because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that the Russians are going to come to our aid, or that there isn't a lot of different ties between Russia and Israel that are, very mutually beneficial, and that Israel at the end of the day didn't condemn like the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the same way, and the Israeli government is aligning itself with the Putin umbrella of far right governments in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So, yeah, I think that I don't know what the word is in English. Almost, it's missing my mind. Tashwish, like it's gonna be like any kind of external actor. Sorry, I didn't hear
Distortion.
you. Distortion, yeah, I guess it's only going to distort the realities of our conflict and who our allies could be, yeah, if it might lead to some short-term gains similar to what Hamas gets out of Iran, but in the long term, as Amjad was saying, like what are the outcomes of aligning ourselves with these, you know, non-aligned governments or whatever, for the future of Palestinian liberation? I'm not sure that that's going to be a positive outcome. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We are right on the hour. Dana and Amjad, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your expert insight into these developing realities in the region. It's no surprise, as you said, Amjad, that the Biden administration has inherited and nurtured these normalization deals. But the so-called security alliance is particularly worrisome in a region growing increasingly authoritarian and evidently poised for future confrontations with Iran. When it comes to Palestine advocacy in Palestine and in normalizing states, you've shown us that the trend set by the United States, by Israel, by Saudi Arabia, and their regional allies must be challenged, both from within Palestine and regionally. From within colonized Palestine, where a new kind of power base must be formed to neighboring normalizing states, where Palestine solidarity activists must articulate anti-normalization in local vernaculars, and with whom Palestinians and their allies across the world must coalesce into a new movement. There's much to be done. So thank you both for sharing these important perspectives with us tonight and for giving us a bit of hope, I would say. I'd also like to thank you, our audience all over the world, for attending this lab and for submitting your thoughts and questions. Before we sign off, I'd like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka, so we do rely on your continued support. If you are able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear at the bottom of your screens. Thank you all so much, and good night.